Welcome everybody to this very special 5 by 15 event this evening. And first up, I wanted to say a huge thank you to Penguin Books, who have helped us very much in making this program possible. It's an honor to have groundbreaking authors with us this evening to discuss the theme of coalition building. And let me quickly introduce our speakers just before we get started, and in particular their books. So Shon Faye is author of The Transgender Issue, a landmark work and an instant Sunday Times bestseller. And it's a call for justice, for solidarity between all marginalized people and minorities. And also joining us this evening, we have Emma Dabiri, an author and academic and broadcaster. Her essay, What White People Can Do Next, From Allyship to Coalition, came out this year and draws on years of research and personal experience to challenge and create meaningful, lasting change about how we talk about racial injustice. Books, as ever, are available from Ewan Bookshop, our book partner, and details will be in the chat. And our chair this evening is Ellie Mae O'Hagan, the Director of Class, and she's been a writer and broadcaster for 10 years. So please don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A box. And I know Ellie will try to come to as many as she can towards the end of this session. But for now, I will hand over to Ellie and say a warm welcome. Thank you all so much for being with us, and over to you.
Thanks, Daisy, and welcome everybody. It's rare for me to jump at the chance to do an event. I'm usually quite bad at replying to emails, but I replied to the invitation to this one within 10 seconds because there are only 3 books that I think I've read in the last 10 years that have really had a profound impact on my politics, to the point where I feel like I crystallized my thoughts or changed my mind completely. And the authors of 2 of them are on this panel. So it's an absolute pleasure to be presenting this event with 2 women who I really admire and respect and have learned a lot from. So I will introduce them to you. So Shon Faye is an author, a broadcaster. She's a Sunday Times bestselling author, and she was recently commemorated, is that the word, or is that only when people die? Celebrated at Trinity College in Dublin for her outstanding contribution to public discourse. And Emma Dabiri is one of her documentaries. Sorry, let me start again. I got ahead of myself. She's an author and broadcaster also, and one of her documentaries recently won a Silver Lion at Cannes Film Festival, if you can believe it. She's also a Sunday Times and an Irish Times bestseller. Welcome, both of you. So this is an event about coalition building, and I'm especially pleased to be chairing this event because the organization that I run, Class, is doing a very long, year-long project about how we build a coalition to sort of fundamentally change the political landscape of this culture and this country. And it's called the Race Class Narrative Project, and it's based on a project that was done in the US to great success. And what the Race Class Narrative Project has found is that this government is using race and wokeness and culture wars in order to divide the working class from one another, to convince the working class that their enemy is their neighbor who might be a person of color, or someone who moved here from another country, or, you know, in the case of this country, someone who is trans. And I'm sure that we'll talk about that in the sort of coming discussion. So it's really relevant to what I'm working on, so I'm really pleased to be here. And before I ask my first question, because what I'm going to do is just going to start a conversation by asking Shon and Emma to give me their thoughts on some things. It would be remiss of me if I didn't shout out to the rally happening at Parliament at the moment about the Health and Social Care Bill, because a massive coalition, because it's something that we all care about, can be built around healthcare, because our health is important, everyone's health is important, and 95% of us can't afford private healthcare. The Health and Social Care Bill is a huge leap forward in the decade-long process of privatizing the NHS. It will break the NHS into 42 parts, and each part will be run by a board where private companies will be allowed to sit on, and the number of people from local authorities who are allowed to sit on those boards is limited, but the number of people from private healthcare companies who are allowed to sit on those boards is unlimited. And that means that they will have a say over who gets care and how much is spent. And this will also increase the already worrying process of American healthcare companies buying out our GP surgeries. So please go to yournhsneedsyou.com and you will see a series of actions you can take to oppose this bill. So I'll leave it there. So Emma and Shon, my first question is, so a lot of people are aware of the issues that you talk about, race and trans rights. But what I have noticed is that in moments where these issues sort of come to the surface a bit more, so for example, during the Black Lives Matter protests or during Trans Awareness Week, for example, what I will come across a lot on things like Instagram are people sharing like pictures or slideshows of saying, you know, 10 tips to be a good ally, or like how to respond if you get called out or something like that. And it strikes me that what you have worked on and what you advocate is actually a very different form of politics to that. And I sometimes think that the people who talk about your work maybe don't appreciate the extent to which these are two different sort of strands of thinking. So I was wondering if you could enlighten us by basically talking about what differs your outlook and your sort of theory of change, if you like, from that kind of activism. And I guess, Shon, do you want to take that one first?
Okay, yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, I feel actually like Emma writes about this more explicitly in What White People Can Do Next, but I would say what differs for me about that, I mean, in terms of like the term allyship, if we start there, is my experience of that was working in the kind of NGO LGBT plus charity sector, where this term ally as a noun in particular, rather than thinking about actions and behaviors, has become kind of reified into this quite corporate way of thinking about it, which is about allowing people who aren't part of a particular group to regard themselves as allies, and even corporations. So, I mean, in the LGBT sector now, it's actually quite common to get like awards for best corporate ally, for example. And so that's kind of the heart of the problem, like a corporation, as the idea that a corporation can be your ally, a sort of like, a thing that only really exists to make money for its shareholder is now your ally. And really, I guess, the issue there is that I think there are actions in allegiance, and obviously that is what the word was intended to express. But for me, it now kind of means somewhat of a patronizing condescension of the idea that people from a position of power can come down and kind of essentially act in a kind of savior role for a particular minority group, in the case of what I write about trans people. And I don't know, there can be, I think some people use the word ally. I don't mean to criticize anyone that uses that term about themselves, if that's particularly the language that they've been introduced to trying to support or stand with trans people in particular. But I think there is a way that it can be marketed and sold as quite a self-regarding title, that you can sort of self-designate yourself as an ally. It comes from a place of benevolence. It means you're a good person. Everyone feels lovely. And then obviously outside of the corporate sphere, where you talked about the Instagram infographics, I see that as an extension out of this kind of corporate diversity and inclusion model, which has really pushed the idea of being trained in being the ally. It's sort of like a self-improvement narrative. Is that obviously, as so many things on Instagram, is that that's still kind of selling this to us now in our private sphere, which is, oh, I'm a white person, Black Lives Matter is resurging across the world as it was last summer, and I don't know what to say or what to do. So there's a sort of sense of, I don't know, like this industriousness of producing infographics and sharing infographics to make you feel like you participate in this kind of positive feeling of being an ally. And I feel like I've spoken enough, but where my politics differs from that is really, it's about the condescension aspect, particularly with trans people, we're such a small group that kind of fair weather dependence really grates on me on a personal level. The idea that I'm constantly sat around waiting for people to come and help me, like gay men to come and help me, or like, you know, cisgender women, cisgender feminists to come and help me. And for me, it's more about looking at the kind of macro level. Is actually, there's lots going on beyond transphobia in society. And as you mentioned just there about healthcare, about bodily autonomy, about these big questions of the state and the state's role to intrude in our lives, there's lots of things that are affecting other people. And it's more about, I'm more about thinking about joined up thinking in terms of resisting that than I am about being aided. And I'll leave that there to let Emma speak.
Emma?
Yeah, thank you. Like I would echo so strongly, you know, so much of what Shon has just said. And wow, that's so unusual on a panel. We need to do more panels together. So yeah, like just to maybe pick up a little further on, to expand on some of those points. Well, first of all, just to reiterate, actually, that idea of kind of atomizing our issues and not looking at kind of bigger picture problems that we have, that we should be, you know, kind of focused on working in solidarity towards overcoming, rather than these kind of like more micro and atomized approaches. I would totally I think that's so important, and I think my work tries to connect the dots between different struggles that seem to be kind of presented as, or just not even spoken about in the same kind of, within the same discourses, even though they are intimately interconnected. But also that notion, or that kind of central tenet of the kind of ally identity, which is that, I think Shon mentioned the word patronizing and savior. And this notion, certainly when we're thinking about race, like we think about the dynamics that exist between Black and white, from the construction, you know, of race, from the invention of the idea of a white race and subsequently a Black race, from its earliest inception, you know, whiteness is encoded with this sense of superiority, and Blackness with inferiority. And I think so much of the allyship, sorry, I can hear one of my children screaming, which is slightly distracting. I think so much of the allyship discourse reinforces that power dynamic. And it is this very, it fails to, I think in terms of anti-racism, a lot of the allyship dynamic fails to really interrogate the way that people who are racialized as white, many people, probably most people who are racialized as white, also, you know, suffer or experience, they don't experience racism, of course, but they experience diminished life opportunities as the result of the inequalities perpetuated by capitalism. And I think the white allyship narrative like fails to address that, and that would be the building block of creating kind of coalitions between Black and white. It fails to address that, and it kind of presents whiteness as this it fails to address that, and it acts as though a white person being involved in these struggles would be somebody who is kind of, you know, doing a favor or is being charitable or benevolent in some way. And yeah, just kind of reinforces white savior dynamics. And I also think a lot of the discourse around it, I just find really frustrating. You know, you hear this kind of, oh no, sorry, before I get to that, and just very quickly, you, what is it? Yeah, you hear this, sorry, the advice for the potential allies often is, and this is something I write about in the book, is like, do not expect to be taught or shown. and that Google is your friend. So I took that advice. I kind of imagined that in the writing of the book, in the researching of what white people can do next, I took that advice and I Googled allyship, and a lot of the literature that came up in terms of anti-racist allyship, you know, was talking about using very explicitly the language of the ally and the victim, and talking about, so again, you know, kind of reinforcing that white savior idea. And then also something I saw referred to that I reference in the book is this idea that the allies' needs are always secondary. So it's this notion of sacrifice and, you know, kind of self-flagellation in a way. And I'm like, who is that appealing to? What kind of personality is that appealing to? And I was like, that's some people that would be aroused by that would be people that have kind of white savior type tendencies. So I just think the way it frames everything is, you know, the framing is distorted. The framing is wrong for me. That was more rambling than I had intended. The screaming was distracting.
I gave you a rundown of things I was going to ask you, but I'm going to spring one on you now, which is, and also, by the way, if either of you want to just chip in on the other one, feel free. But like, so I wanted to ask then, in that case, given like the criticisms that you both have made of allyship, how do we move past racism and misogyny and transphobia being a series of interpersonal relations and start seeing it as something more structural? Shon, I guess.
Yeah, you have sprung that. I'm like, because that's a big question. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think where I look, I mean, in the research for the book, I mean, the history is full of examples of that. So like, as someone that's like a history nerd, I think it's interesting to look at former political coalitions and where they worked. And I think, yeah, effective political coalitions, particularly between oppressed groups, marginalized groups, or minority groups, you know, I think it's really key that this isn't like Emma said, the kind of savior victim dynamic. Often these things are really, really difficult forms of coalition where these people come from quite a different place and there isn't going to be completely mutual understanding. I think you have to kind of lose that idea. And I think that kind of social media, Twitter idea, that makes people freeze as well, because obviously some people get very invested in this ally narrative, but other people feel completely alienated by it. That the fact that they're so afraid, I know this with trans stuff, right? Like people are so afraid of saying something wrong that they actually don't do anything. And there has to be space for a pragmatism that is like, you can't really understand my interior experience and you can't understand what it's like to exist in this society, in this body, but also you don't really have to. You have to just understand the material needs that I have, that you probably have, particularly if we're both, even for different reasons, having them. So I don't know if you want like a historical example, or if it like, I mean, I could provide one.
Well, I was going to come to that next, but we could just we could combine the two together, and you can, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, well, for example, like here's a really classic example is that is between like gay liberation campaigners, which included trans people in the US at the start of the gay liberation movement. Obviously, the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton, you know, gave a speech basically saying that, you know, the gay liberation front and the women's liberation movement should be allies of the Black liberation movement. It's quite like, and he gives a speech in like 1970 where he says, we should be careful about using those terms that might turn our friends off. The terms faggot and punk should be deleted from our vocabulary. And especially we should not attach names normally designed for homosexuals to men who are enemies of the people, such as Nixon. Homosexuals are not enemies of the people. And I think, you know, like, imagine someone tweeting that. But the point I think there is, if you, even the tone, the language, right, is that he's speaking perhaps to an audience of people who perhaps were using homophobic terms, and you wouldn't be saying it if they weren't. But the purpose there is, there is a pragmatism to it. Is that this is, you do not have to fully understand, or even, you know, for religious reasons, whatever, understand necessarily every aspect of like gay life or gay liberation, but these people are being oppressed in the same way, and we're forming a political allegiance with them. Therefore, it's necessary in that example to restrict use of alienating terms, that we like choose to use language that's mutually intelligible, because we don't want to like offend. And it's a pragmatic idea. And some people would say, yeah, but I want, on a personal level, that I want someone not to use this slur against me because it's wrong, not because it suits their goals. But I don't think that works in terms of building broad coalitions. Frankly, like I would love everyone to have a full sensitivity and a deep interest in my experience as a trans woman, but like that's, in Britain, for example, in the context in which we're operating now, that's not the case. There's not going to be never enough diversity and inclusion trainings and people engaging with them for that to be the case. So we have to think more pragmatically about, you don't have to understand this. Perhaps you could like restrain, choosing not to use language that might be hurtful, but with the end goal of, for example, if universal credit is being cut, that will disproportionately affect trans people. So will it disproportionately affect, I don't know, racialized people who are more likely to be working in lower paid precarious roles, or are more likely to experience homelessness, for example. I'm going to let Emma speak now because I feel like I'm rambling.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you. And I think that's often what's lacking, what seems to be absent in so much of the current discourse that one sees online. And I think so much of the discourse that's online like also migrates offline, and starts to inform the way the kind of anti-racism is understood. But it seems to often lack clear or certainly collective objectives, and to exist perhaps more on the level of interpersonal exchange, and perhaps even personal advancement. And I think because clearly identifiable objectives are often unstated or unknown, a lot of the attempts that we're seeing are just not, they're not strategic, they're not pragmatic. To again reference, and so many of the answers, so many examples are there in the very recent historical record, So again, to draw on the Panthers, another example that I use in the book, that I think is becoming increasingly commonly known, but certainly lots of people had said to me they had never heard about this, was the original Rainbow Coalition, where Fred Hampton, the leader of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panthers, created a coalition comprised of the Black Panthers, a Puerto Rican former gang called the Young Lords, and a Southern white working class gang called the Young Patriots. And I think the coalition with the Young Patriots is particularly interesting in terms of pragmatism and attempts to be strategic to achieve collective objectives, in that the Young Patriots had the Confederate flag. So the Confederate flag being, the symbol of the slave-owning South, a particularly loaded and charged, kind of a white supremacist symbol, right? This was their symbol. This was their marker. And Hampton was extremely pragmatic in saying, obviously, I doubt he felt comfortable, with that, but he's saying, if we can use it to work with these people to achieve our goals, which benefit us all, then let's do it. And I think was really one of the many things that's so interesting about that example is that the Young Patriots then themselves renounced the flag. So rather than being, called out or cancelled or harangued in some way, they themselves, through working with the Panthers, actually renounced the flag. And I think that type of change is far more, that type of reflection, where the change kind of comes in that way, feels like it would be a lot less performative than change that comes from, fear of public shaming or being called out online,
Sorry if I vanished there for a moment. My internet died, which has never happened before in the whole 2 years of COVID. So I'm glad you all got to witness that. So I guess I was wondering, and we're also just want to say that we're halfway through. So please do remember to stick your questions in the chat, and I might actually come to them a bit early because we already have some and they're really good. I was wondering then, you've both written books within a year of one another, right? That advocate for coalition building. And I was wondering what inspired you to write those books, and was it anything to do with the moment that we're in? And maybe I feel a bit bad going to Emma first because you just spoke, but I also feel bad going to Shon first all the time because she has to think on her feet a bit more. So maybe Emma this time, if that's okay.
Let's mix it up, yeah. In the spirit of fairness. So mine was unequivocally very, very much born of the moment. I had never felt particularly inclined to write about allyship, to talk about allyship in any expanded way. I'd been asked actually many times, but I really didn't feel it was where my energy was best served, being focused in that space. However, in the kind of aftermath of the murder of Floyd George and the level of the volume of conversation about allyship and the multiple frustrations I felt about the way the conversations were being framed, and the again frustration I think I felt at what was, I felt like we had this historic opportunity, or we'd created, this historic opportunity, circumstances had created this historic opportunity, and maybe its potential was being squandered by an anti-racist narrative that actually reproduced or reinforced some of the problems that it seeks to overcome, such as a kind of immutable difference between Black and white, and a further reification of the very racial categories that were invented in order to create racism, which was created for a number of reasons. One, the architecture of race, that we live with today has its roots in, and the idea of a white race and a Black race has its roots in it's created in the 17th century in the colonial Caribbean and what will become the United States. And part of it is from its earliest inception, is this idea that the people who become racialized as white have this inherent superiority to the people who become racialized as Black, and that's used to justify the transatlantic slave trade, which is necessary because of the huge wealth that it is that it is generating in this period. So the idea of a white race and a Black race, does that work very effectively? It also shuts down the coalitions that are emerging between indentured European laborers and enslaved Africans, or at the very beginning of the kidnapping of Africans, it's actually before slavery becomes entrenched. Some are actually indentured laborers in the very, very early periods. But race, the narrative of race and the codification of race creates this immutable difference between those groups. And prevents these coalitions that had been emerging, where the two groups were seeing European landlords as their common enemy. And there were a number of rebellions. But what a lot of the current anti-racist narrative seemed to be doing was actually further reifying race, when we should be, at the very least, really thinking about how we can lessen how we can kind of eventually dissolve these categories. So yeah, mine was born out of a frustration and a fear that we were squandering opportunity.
Shon?
Yeah, so I guess writing my book, I think it was because I had seen this growth of so-called trans visibility in the, surge of it in the 2010s, that decade. And I think there was a growing kind of liberal hope that trans people would achieve some kind of undefined equality in a kind of similar manner to the way that perhaps most cis LGB people did, just like we were on a 20-year time lag, but society would just wake up, which is a kind of collective amnesia about how sexuality and sexual diversity came to be more widely accepted anyway, and the costs of that. So there was this kind of, this assumption that visibility, representation, and culture in the arts would somehow trickle down and help us, and that society just wouldn't mind. So there was that aspect of it, and that had clearly failed, right? Like, if anything, we were lurching towards, especially as I was really in the thick of writing the first draft, Boris Johnson had become, we'd seen the most homophobic and overtly transphobic government for decades, pretty much since Thatcher. And so this kind of hope of somehow visibility and winning acceptance purely by cultural representation wasn't going to work. And so it's like, well, what is going to work? And one of the huge difficulties for trans people is we're less than 1% of the population. So in terms of writing about coalition, it was absolutely necessary that, like, we aren't going to be able to liberate ourselves anyway, like that. What would that even look like? But, just on a purely pragmatic level. On some level, I knew I had to write about the LGBT coalition, which in and of itself, it's not a self-contained group. It's itself a strategic coalition, because there is a huge difference between many people's experiences under that label, under that umbrella. So I knew I was going to have to expound upon that, because one of the main ways that transphobia has manifested in the British media is the idea that trans people are a threat to lesbians, to gay men, to bi people. To a lesser extent, they kind of tend to forget about bi people. So having to kind of reassert, like, LGBT, again, this atomization of identity, that, like, people are encouraged now to be like, well, I am, this is my gender, this is my sexuality, this kind of, like, these are the labels I feel comfortable with. So yeah, that's all fine. And that could be really different to someone else who's also LGBT. But this exists and always has existed as a political coalition. And that's where it's most effective. And that's why you're encouraged, the infighting is encouraged by the media, is because they want to break up that coalition, because it's been quite effective in some ways. Historically and currently. And then, like, also, it's just like how to make people care. Like, trans people have always experienced this alienation, estrangement, where we're made to be seen as this complex, difficult thing that people don't really understand. And I felt that was an inhibition to actually people forming coalitions with us, or people understanding us, or standing in solidarity with us. And so, for example, how do you make people care about the desperate healthcare crisis? Like, the media doesn't report on it. It's relatively small numbers of the population. This won't touch most people. So if you say, oh, there's a 6-year waiting list for the gender identity clinic, like, how many people, unless they have a trans person in their life, are really going to care about that? So then you have to start to think about, well, what is this about? This is about bodily autonomy. There's links there to, like, reproductive rights for anyone with a uterus, but, majoritively cisgender women. You can think about, like, healthcare inequality and discrimination. I mean, that obviously is something that affects people of color more than it does white people, women than it does more than men. And so, like, there are suddenly all these links, if you start to make it around these broader ideas, where you can actually make it relevant to people, to be like, well, actually, it's quite paternalistic and patriarchal that governments and doctors can take this healthcare away, or just let you languish for years. And we're not the only group they do this to. And then you hope that someone who's reading it, who has no experience with the trans thing, will be like, I know that the outcomes are worse for me as a Black woman, or I know that, like, as a disabled person living with a chronic illness, I'm languishing on waiting lists for years. And it speaks again to that idea that allyship is that trans people can sometimes be painted as this, like, vulnerable, mousy little group who we should all pity, but are largely defenseless. And actually, that's both, there's an inertia around that too, because it encourages this, like, trans rights are human rights, poor trans people, but there's an inertia there, because it's like, oh, there's nothing you can really do to help them. And so, well, actually, yes, there is. And if I make that seem relevant to you about how it might be connected to your own struggle, you might be more incentivized to think about that kind of coalition. So I guess that was what was going through my head. And I would say as well, of the moment, I wrote the vast majority of the first draft in the first lockdown, and actually the resurgence of Black Lives Matter last June happened between the two drafts. And that combined with the pandemic starting as I was writing it too, which we forget how apocalyptic the first lockdown really felt. I think that kind of furthered me on, because there was a more of a tepid liberal apologia I could have written and was probably flirting with in the back of my mind. But when that like is all happening in the world, you just like, it kind of just felt like a reinforcement that now is not the time, when people are challenging things like carceral justice, then it's not the time to be kind of squeamish. And I'm glad I didn't, because the climate crisis is a disaster. So now is not really the time for kind of squeamish, slightly assimilationist arguments, I think.
Well, as you've both been talking, I've gone drunk with power as chair, and I've decided to throw out the schedule and go straight to questions, because they're really good. And I've also decided to use my mighty power as chair to say that I think that the establishment doesn't like talking about what you were just talking about, Shon, because actually what is best for all people, and especially people who are people of colour or trans or women, is a radical changing of society and a redistribution of wealth and power. And I think that's why we're not talking about it, but I would say that. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, how do you both feel about the concept of privilege? Privileged person has done that. As it's used today in political discourse, is it a helpful concept?
I can respond to that. So when I first became aware of privilege discourse, it was probably around 2011 or so, 2010, sometime like that. And I was just like, oh, this is great. Like, this really gives a name. I think I'd spoken about like kind of this luxury that white people who are racialized as white have, of like moving through the world. Might have even said privilege, you know, moving through the world as unracialized, you know, moving through the world just as the default norm from which everyone else deviates. So when I came across the kind of like privilege discourse as conceived of by Peggy McIntosh in, I think, 1989, when she wrote a list unpacking the invisible knapsack. And she's a white woman, a white feminist American scholar. I was like, oh, this is great. This is really naming that thing and giving like the language. And as it started to come more into popular discourse and people started to be more familiar with it, there was just like this thing was being named and like addressed. And I was enthusiastic about it. Over the years, I saw it kind of become, you know, quite untethered from that application and just becoming, you know, the types of privileges, you know, were just, you know, also being, you know, like salami sliced, and everything, all of these conversations, you know, that need to be equally, if not more so, about the redistribution of wealth and power. That aspect was being, you know, kind of overlooked. And so much of the discourse was just being grounded, particularly, you know, online. Because again, this is a concept that was originally, first of all, kind of more just in the academy and maybe amongst, you know, activists before activism had become this kind of social media phenomenon. So kind of more like grassroots. But as it became, you know, as privilege kind of became like big business, it kind of took up all this interpersonal privilege, took up all of the bandwidth. And it was like, in terms of anti-racism, there was little anti-racist discourse, mainstream anti-racist discourse. There seemed to be little attention given to connecting dots, the bigger picture and the way we need to be, you know, thinking about capitalism, about class, and about the redistribution of wealth and resources. They seem to be getting kind of, those concerns were sidelined, seemingly sidelined, with this concern on people kind of accusations and denials of forms of interpersonal privilege, which, you know, is a space in which the kind of change that needs to happen can never occur on that individual level. So in a way, it's kind of a highway to nowhere. It may serve some sort of, you know, it can be kind of gratifying on a personal level, and there can be a necessity for it, but it was almost like that hijacked everything else. Also, to just say very quickly as well, scholars like Barbara Fields, and I talk about this in What White People Could Do Next, say that, you know, narratives around, it's not to say white privilege doesn't exist, okay? But it is to say that if we want to create mass movements that are so powerful, you know, that their demands cannot be ignored, and we want to be strategic in what it is that we want to achieve and what our objectives are. It's not about placating people and not being truthful. It's not about that, just giving people these kind of, you know, kind of softly narratives so they can feel included. But it is about kind of effective and strategic narrative. And if you have a kind of an overemphasis on a story that says, well, your life is just this one of unmitigated, you know, privilege and ease, how do you draw, and you can't really say anything or contribute to this conversation, but at the same time, silence is violence. So there's kind of there is an inherent kind of contradiction there. But how do you draw people in? How do you identify, how do you let people identify that it is actually in their best interest to be working side by side with you? Because there are ways that they are also oppressed and exploited, that were everybody to work together, we might have more success in changing. So I will stop there.
Shon, do you want to add anything?
I mean, like, yeah, I would echo a lot of that. I think in the context of gender, there's real sticking points there. Privilege is a difficult thing to talk about with gender, because I realize that this is like one of the huge sticking points, for example, for certainly like gender critical feminists, or like particularly actual radical feminists, I think from the 70s, and their issues with some trans discourses. It was being presented, certainly, like, yeah, when I was first becoming aware of it, sort of like maybe like 5 to 10 years ago, was this idea of cis privilege. And it just seemed to be like a red rag to a bull, because basically I think a lot of cisgender women felt that like a gender system that's designed, their gender is constructed to be, you know, like inferior to men, and they had suffered a lot from that. The idea that people, particularly trans women, who they believe had moved from the kind of dominant class, and were attempting to infiltrate their class, like it really was like a red rag to a bull that like they might have privilege in a gender system as women, and so like, you know, I think I was trying to think creatively around that, because it just seemed to be an issue. But also, yeah, I think the other thing to say is that, yeah, for trans women too, is that obviously some schools of feminist thought have this idea of like an indelible male privilege, which is used against trans women, that we cannot, we retain this kind of mystical indelible male privilege, regardless of how our social position might change, or indeed how we might have been socialized as gender non-conforming even before transition. And so this privilege model doesn't fit, like, for me. And for me, it's very much, I think it's less helpful for me to think about privilege and more about power. And power can shift contextually. So like a very simple example would be that, like, well, firstly, like 99.4% of the population is cisgender. Therefore, there is a certain collective power that cisgender people may have in building the world in which I live, you know, like as a trans person, in terms of lots of context. And then, for example, like, you know, rather than saying all cisgender women have privilege over me, what I might say is a psychiatrist who can psychiatrically assess me to decide whether or not I get certain medical treatment could be a cisgender woman. It's never going to be a trans woman. It just isn't. That's not how trans healthcare is set up. So in that context, she does have power over me. And of course, you might say, look to the wider profession of psychiatry and say it was a very male-dominated profession, but generally it's a cisgender profession, it's a cisgender male profession. But in that context, she has the backing of that profession and has a certain degree of dominion over my life and my body. Similarly, like a group of female MPs who are cisgender would, in that context. So I think for me, power and how it's exercised and in whose interests is more relevant a question than privilege, especially when it comes to to gender.
We have a question which I feel like is quite relevant to the current moment. Let me see if I can find it. I just lost it. Who the hell really cares what celebrities think? Do we all care too much about what individual celebrities think when it's the structural things that are the problem? So I guess I'll rephrase that as in what role, if any, do celebrities have in this, and are they a distraction or overshadowing the sort of core work that needs to be done?
I can start with that if we're doing that flip. So yeah, I certainly think they can. I think the sort of disproportionate focus on them again is symptomatic of this social media, Twitter commentary where it's day by day, and certainly I find it frustrating. For example, let me talk on the trans side as a discourse I'm part of, and then I'll give another example. But for example, the disproportionate focus on the author of Harry Potter, right? That I find the fact that seeing signs at protests about that person, about her or about her work or whatever, it's but she's not, she may have views that are objectionable to people who are interested in trans rights, but really it's frustrating when the conversation locks on that. And I found when I've been doing publicity around this book, especially the more mainstream, I go out of kind of more left-wing media, people want to ask me about her, and that's a self-fulfilling narrative. And it's well, I'm here to talk about, the healthcare inequality, the fact that it's 3 to 6 years waiting lists on the NHS with no chance of that being brought down. And I think that is partly because of celebrity culture. And then I was going to give an example. I think when I was perhaps, at the same time, I do think that celebrities can be useful examples, probably a lot of my understanding of how racialized misogyny works against women of color, and particularly Black women, perhaps was people tweeting about Beyonce circa 2014. Do you know what I mean? I think I'm sure it's fine as an entry level thing, and it's a lens to view these things. But it's interesting with celebrities when we focus on them so much is that they also have a class position, and it typically is an extremely actually privileged wealthy one. So any kind of examples that they might be being used to demonstrate, as an example of a phenomena like racism or transphobia or whatever, to me it's always going to be limited, because it's going to limit itself to the identity and not to the person's class position, which when we're talking about celebrities is automatically going to be better than most of ours, if that makes sense. So yeah, basically to round that off, I think there is a disproportionate focus on them, both as examples, teachable examples, and also as, focuses of outrage.
Yeah, and I think it's also because we have this obsession with platforms, and so many of these conversations are happening via, platform capitalism on these sites. And so the bigger your platform and the more followers you have, which obviously celebrities are going to have a distinct kind of advantage with, that equates to some form of worth or expertise. So what they have to say about topics that they might actually have quite limited understanding of is given this very elevated importance because of their platform. And then also sometimes the idea that people are, you know, only engaged in these conversations because now, or not only, but perhaps, you know, partially motivated to engage in these conversations at this moment in a cynical way, because it's seen as a way of building one's platform and perhaps entering the sphere of celebrity oneself. So yeah, I think the whole question around celebrities is very pertinent and yeah, interesting.
Thank you. I actually know somebody whose mum is a sort of kind of home counties kind of type, not political at all, who's become very, very enthusiastic about Black Lives Matter because she loves Formula One, and Lewis Hamilton talks about Black Lives Matter. She has t-shirts now about Black Lives Matter.
Is she an anti-racist influence in it?
No. She's just my friend's mum.
Okay.
This is a good one. How much should we be careful not to use shorthand terms when trying to build coalitions with others? I think what this person means is sort of activist jargon, maybe. How much should our energy be put towards first making sure that two groups speak or at least understand each other's languages?
Yeah, I mean, certainly to a degree, I think, you know, it depends where, yeah, I mean, I think code switching is part of campaigning and activism anyway. I think you have to meet people where they're at. And I do think language can become a barrier at times. I mean, like, you know, I've had this before. I've had like people who are living in London, like, you know, trans queer people, etc., living in like London in all trans queer commune houses, whatever, and can be quite strident about, you know, can't believe people are still saying this in 2021. But like, for example, when I worked for Stonewall, we were doing like, I don't know, trans training for like GPs, receptionists. And, you know, at this point you were having to tell people the very basics of this is kind of a transphobic thing to say because they had no clue. And I don't know, I feel like you have to be able to speak to both sides with that. And I think there is a, you know, I think, again, it's like Huey Newton example I gave about the like, so like we don't use this word. It's that the ideal is it's not that you have to have, not every person is going to need to have a fully theorized intellectual understanding of, like, for example, why you say assigned male at birth instead of born male. You know, there is a point where you have to kind of accept people's intentions, and then yeah, you have to just go with mutually agreed upon language, you know, and that's to be negotiated. And I mean, that's the thing about why organizing, I guess, alongside people, as opposed to we've really dissed the internet and social media in this session, but like these things evolve naturally when you actually work with people side by side, I think, in real life. I mean, human beings are naturally given towards that mutual understanding and kind of meeting somewhere in the middle in terms of language, and like, you know, I prefer if you didn't say this, or like, actually, I describe myself this way. You know, I think Twitter, for example, and again, this like marketization of it, of training, that you need to be given a glossary of terms to use. I mean, that's partly the sort of like part of the diversity and inclusion ally industry is, here's a body of knowledge, we're going to sell you it because you don't know what to do and you're going to probably get yourself fired. And of course, like actual organizing, grassroots movements don't work that way. I don't know if that answers the question, but like, if it doesn't, luckily Emma can fill in the gaps.
But one of the things that I was very frustrated by, that, you know, actually like inspired the book, was actually just these mantras, just these stock phrases that I was hearing like repeated again and again. And I felt, you know, oh man, I felt like eye roll when I'd hear them. And I'm like, I'm sure if I feel like this, there's probably lots of other people as well. But perhaps, you know, you can't say it because that would be problematic or toxic, or not wanting to engage with your privilege, or one of these terms. But things like Google is your friend, you know, I was like, that is terrible advice. Like, when I take that advice to try and learn more about anti-racism, and I just don't know where to start, and I'm just Googling these random terms, I'm being presented with things that are, you know, actually quite unhelpful. I don't want that to be where people who want to work together and contribute to this movement, I don't want whatever random shit they happen to find on, like, via Google, to be kind of their blueprint. And then other things like, oh, we're going to have to get uncomfortable, that you hear all the time. And I'm like, why does this change actually, you know, why? This is just this repeated, just this phrase that people are repeating. I'm like, why can't personal and collective transformation actually be, you know, liberating and exciting, and like, why just uncomfortable? That's also really unappealing, you know, unless you're trying to kind of do penance, or you're somebody that is kind of aroused by some sort of kind of like saviorism, you know? Why does it have to be so uncomfortable? It should be exciting to learn how so many things you've been taught are actually, you know, are, to me, it's inspiring. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of stock phrases that I find really frustrating and unproductive.
We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to ask one more, which I think is a good rounding us off question, and it's from Isabel. And if you're wondering why I never said anyone else's name, it's because only Isabel has put her name in the name box. So thank you, Isabel. And her question is, I'm interested to know what Shon and Emma think are success factors for effective coalition building. And maybe I can encourage you, this is me talking now, to like reach back into those historical examples again.
Sorry, I missed the question because I was reading the other questions. I got distracted.
Oh, sorry. What are success factors? What do you think are success factors in effective coalition building? Please keep it to 30 seconds. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, like, I mean, I'm tempted to think of Northern Ireland and the kind of peace process there. You have to recognize that, like, effective coalitions take, you know, they take time to build. It's really about time, willingness, and yeah, they don't happen overnight. They don't have the dopamine rush of of, like, you know, this sort of stuff. It's years work, and it's about progressive, and it's incremental, and it's slow. I mean, that's the reality that we're facing with. We're discussing it in these quite, like, you know, offhanded way for an hour-long panel, but these things take decades, and they're revisited as well. I think, you know, a lot of coalitions, as I say about the LGBT coalition, for example, is that I think that one has renewed itself in many different contexts and times, and will need to again. For example, in Europe, where there's ultra right-wing conservative attacks on LGBT rights, there will be a resurgence of that as a political coalition rather than a consumer bracket. I'll finish there.
I think there's quite a few examples that were so threatening to the status quo that the threat was neutralized, you know. So if you think about, like, Martin Luther King, just before he was assassinated, before he was killed, he was working on a poor people's campaign, which was to bring all working and poor people in the United States together into a mass movement, you know. Similarly with Fred Hampton, that Rainbow Coalition, which had the potential to bring on board, you know, working and oppressed and minoritized people throughout the States, potentially throughout the world. Again, he was like, he didn't get to see that through. But yeah, I think these ideas, as Shon said, are revisited. But I think it's really important that our organizing and our thinking and our discourse isn't untethered from these from these historical, that we have a familiarity with the history, which is what I felt very frustrated by with so much of the kind of liberal mainstream anti-racist discourse, that it seemed untethered from kind of this historical context.
Well, thank you both, and especially for that heroic effort of keeping to time at the end. That hour flew by, and I'm really sorry that we didn't get to ask all of your questions, because they were all really, really good. Some of them were so challenging that I didn't put them to the panel, because I thought, oh God, I'm not sure, that's really hard. But that just shows how like rigorous all of your thoughts were. So thank you so much. And I guess I'm handing back over to Daisy now. Thanks so much to Shon and Emma. I'm sure that Daisy will remind you about where to buy the books, which you should. I've read them both. I read them both in one sitting, actually, and they're great.
Ellie, thank you so much. What a fantastic interview, and what a hopeful and engaging discussion. So yes, please buy the books, The Transgender Issue by Shon Faye and What White People Can Do Next by Emma Dabiri are both out now. And I know that Newham Books would be delighted to help, and the details are in the chat. We will share them again tomorrow as well, along with a recording of the session. We need news stories to unite disparate areas and different groups, and I think these two authors are really paving the way, and it's been such an honor to hear from you both, all three of you this evening. So thank you very, very much. But now that's all we've got time for. So for this evening, good night and thank you.
Thanks, guys. Good night.
Thanks.